이루어지는 노력의 역사입니다. 오늘 이 한 걸음이 한반도 평화공존을 향한 새로운 길을 만들기를 바라봅니다.
K-pop's influence in the global music market has grown beyond imagination. With the momentum of the broader Korean wave, what new boundaries might we cross next? Join us for the final chapter in our K-pop series.
여러분은 그 캐대원에서 가장 인상 깊었던 장면 하나 꼽는다면 뭐인가요?
일단 눈에 한국적 캐릭터가 왜 이렇게 많이 깔리지? 그중에 제일 신기했던 게 1월 오봉도라고 아세요? 제가 이거 갖고 왔는데
네.
예, 제가 보여드릴게요. 그 1월 오봉도가 뭐냐면은 해와 달이 있고 5봉우리가 있는 3봉우리가 있는 모습인데 이게 우리나라에만 있는 아주 특이한 왕을 호위하는 왕의 자리를 표시하는 상징물이에요. 이 그림이 곳곳에 깔리더라고요. 1월 오봉도가 있다라는 것은 거기 왕이 계시다는 뜻이고 그 주인공들이 연주를 하고 있다는 것은 왕 앞에서 연주한다는 그런 상징이에요. 어찌 보면은 이 모습이 단순히 대중을 위해서 뭘 한다 정도가 아니라 그것이 어찌 보면은 신과 연결될 수 있고 사람과 연결되는 중간자적 역할을 한다는 그 깊은 상징성을 갖고 있거든요.
저는 사실은 너무 시작에 인트로에 나오는 글이 너무 감동이어가지고 제 SNS에 올려놨거든요. 그 내용이 뭐냐면 우리 음악은 영혼에 불을 지피고 사람들을 하나로 모아주지. 그 유대감으로 최초의 헌터들은 세상을 지킬 방패를 만들었어. 라는 이제 인트로가 나와요. 결국은 음악이, 문화예술이 우리 사회를 인류세 또는 포스트 휴머니즘 사회에서 우리 사회를 구원할 거야 라는 메시지가 처음 시작에 나오더라고요. 이 애니메이션이 갖고 있는 우리에게 주는 메시지가 저는 굉장히 좋았고 그래서 우리가 뭐 여러 가지 한국 문화들이 거기에 잘 얹어질 수 있었던 힘이 거기에 있지 않았을까라는 생각을 했습니다.
사실 그 개념이 씻긴 굿 개념이 있거든요. 뭔가 어렵고 힘든 것을 씻어주는 거예요. 그때 무당들이 음악으로 뭔가 신과 인간을 풀어주는 역할인데 그 말씀을 바로 해주시니까 너무 좋네요.
그 말씀하신 것처럼 관련된 미장센이 계속 나와요.
그러니까요.
그러니까 호랑이가 나오는 순간 아 얘가 좋은 일을 만들려고 이러는 거구나.
맞아요.
까치가 같이 나오는 순간 뭔가 좋은 일이 있구나라는 미장센은 계속 깔아줘서 네.
저기 보면 저희 교수님께서 또 호잣돌을 이렇게
네네네.
갖고 오셨어요.
네네.
그러니까 저는 이 그림을 어디서 봤냐면 저 중학교 때 이걸로 저희는 파나 만들었었거든요. 화성 조각도로. 근데 이게 K-pop 데몬 헌터스에 나오는 거예요. 이 상징이. 그래서
여기 보면 크게 호랑이, 범과 그다음 까치가 함께 있는데 사실 우리의 연희 내용 중에 무슨 그 탈춤이나 하해춤이라든지 다른 각종 춤에 보면은 대상으로 등장하는 주인공들이 양반이나 스님이나 근데 그들을 아주 놀리고 그 모순적인 걸 혼내주고 그런 건데 이 민화도 그런 상징성이 있어요. 그래서 씻어주고 풀어주고 우리의 가장 중요한 것은 상대편을 싫어한다고 해서 박멸하고 점령하고 없애고가 아니라 그들이 갖고 있는 문제를 같이 풀어주면서 우리의 갖고 있는 근본적인 문제가 사라지게 하는 그런 게 거의 K-pop 데몬 헌터스에도 깔려 있거든요.
사실 요즘 혐오의 시대 그러잖아요.
네.
그런 시대에 정말 어떻게 보면 필요한.
근데 이게 대중문화의 정말 매력적인 포인트인데 우리가 지금 이런 얘기를 되게 디테일하게 풀었지만 이걸 우리가 그 안에 있는 민속 문화나 역사나 상징성을 이제 한국 사람한테 그럼 외국 사람이 볼 애니메이션을 만들어 달라 그러면 교육 자료를 만들었어요.
맞아요. 이렇게 못 만들죠.
이거는 좋은 의미에서의 끼워 팔기거든요.
네.
사실 외국 사람들이 열광하는 거는 이 디테일은 아니에요.
맞아요.
다만 그 스토리에 공감하고 음악이 갖고 있는 어떤 힘에 대한 얘기들 그리고 무엇보다도 거기 나오는 음악들이 너무 좋아서 사실은 중독돼서 보는 거거든요. 그런데 그 와중에 한 코프를 더 벗기고 들어가 보니까 그 안에는 무시 못할 어떤 한국의 역사가 있고 문화가 있으면 이거를 통해서 이제 그 안으로 다시 또 들어가게 되는 거죠. 저도 미국에 있을 때 뭐 그런 문화원이나 이런 것들을 통해서 사람들에게 뭐 민속 문화도 가르쳐보고 여러 가지 해봤지만 그런 것과는 또 별개로 외국 사람들이 굉장히 친숙하게 받아들일 수 있는 그리고 그 자체로 즐길 수 있는 엄숙하지 않은 그런 문화 속에서
맞아요.
그 안에서 우리의 것을 자연스럽게 알아가게 하는 게 사실은 K-팝 그리고 K-컬처의 좀 역할인 것 같아요.
지금 세계 유일의 분단 국가로서 그러니까 북한은 그러면 과연 어떤 노래를 듣고 어떤 음악, 문화를 향유하고 있는지 갑자기 궁금해지는데요.
제가 굉장히 흥미롭게 생각하는 건 뭐냐면 김옥주라는 가수가 있어요. 그러니까 김정은 시대 때 한 6년 동안 인민배우로 칭호를 안 내리다가 이제 내려서 이 사람이 누구야 했었던 사람인데 우리도 잘 알아요. 남북이 함께 공연했을 때 이선이랑 같이 무대에 올랐던 사람이에요. 여정이라고 왁스가 불렀던 노래 있죠.
아, 네네.
그 노래를 김옥주가 부른 게 있어요. 북한에서.
공연 때.
네네. 그 국무위원회 연주단, 북한 연주단 같이 한 거 있는데 그 여정 노래 같은 그룹으로 되게 좋아요. 그러니까 예를 들면 남북이 원래 같이 분단전에 같이 있었기 때문에 전통을 공유한다. 우리가 좋아하는 전통 노래를 여기도 좋아한다. 이런 거는 이해할 수 있는데 여정 같은 그룹으로 좋아한다는 거는 뭔가 이게 한 핏줄 아닌가 생각이 드는 거예요. 또 하나는 분단 직전의 노래들, 뭐 고향에 대한 나의 노래도 그렇고 반월이라는 노래도 그렇고 네, 마찬가지고 그런 여전히 우리가 분단 직전에 불렀던 뭐 설날에 까치까치 노래들 같은 여전히 계속 같이 부르고 있거든요.
우리는 북한의 문화에 대해서 그들의 취향에 대해서 그들이 공식적으로 내세우는 자료를 통해서만 판단하니까 그거를 북한 인민의 취향이라고 생각할 수가 있어요.
맞아요.
그렇지 않다는 거죠. 예. 그 사람들이 좋아하는 거는 저는 과연 다를까? 예전에 그 어목했던 냉전 시대에 과연 소련 사람들은 미국의 팝 음악을 싫어했을까? 절대 그럴 리가 없거든요.
네.
사람의 취향이 동시대를 살면서 아무리 정치 체제가 다르다고 완벽하게 다를 수는 없는 거예요.
북한도 사실은 굉장히 이렇게 동떨어져 있는 것 같지만 거기 안에도 여러 가지 흐름들이 있고 비공식 시장도 있고 하는 과정 안에서 동시대성이 있는 거죠. 듣고 좋은 거예요. 듣고 좋은 거는
그냥 좋은 거죠.
그냥 좋은 거예요.
좋아하라고 해서 좋은
네.
게 아니라
이거 듣지 마. 예를 들면 우리 힙합 같은 거요. 되게 좋아하시잖아요. 되게 싫어하시는 어머님들 많이 있으세요. 그렇잖아요. 우리 안에서도 그런데 그런 거를 좋아하는 동시대성의 세대들이 자라나고 있다. 그 부분에서 우리가 옛날 거라서 한민족인 것도 있지만 지금의 우리가 갖고 있는 이 부분도 열심히 생각해봐야 된다고 생각합니다.
그 우리 K-팝에서 어떻게 보면은 그 남북한의 화해의 실마리를 찾을 수도 있을 것 같아요.
저는 오히려 K-팝이 서로 간에 공통된 정서를 찾기 결코 어려운 장르가 아니라고 생각하거든요. 그러니까 지금도 이제 우리가 기성세대 입장에서는 K-팝 하면은 뭔가 좀 접근하기 어려울 것 같고 거부감을 갖고 있는 분들도 많지만 사실 K-팝이 갖고 있는 기본적인 특성은 그 안에 어떤 이념이나 철학을 굳이 담아내려고 하지 않는다는 거예요.
네.
실제 보여주는 그 몸의 역동성 그리고 노래가 주는 감동 같은 것들을 오히려 직관적으로 보여주는 음악이기 때문에 거기서 어떻게 보면 양국이 이해할 수 있는 어떤 적정한 지점 정도를
공통의 즐거움.
그렇죠.
네.
찾아낸다면 그거 자체가 그냥 우리에게 익숙한 하나의 흥의 문화로서 충분히 만들어갈 수 있는 그런 어떤 템플릿, 토대가 될 수 있다고 봐요.
한때 SNS를 휩쓸었던 쇼폼이 있어요. 지금 무슨 노래 들어요? 그러면 딱 나 어떤 노래 듣고 있어요. 왜 옛날에는 당신이 무엇을 먹는지 말해달라. 그러면 당신이 누군지 알려주겠다라는 말처럼 요즘은 당신이 어떤 음악을 듣고 있는지 알려달라. 그러면 당신이 어떤 사람인지 알려주겠다라는 말이 요즘에 오히려 더 맞지 않을까 싶습니다. 그러니까 우리가 지금 분단의 현실에 처해 있지만 과연 우리 미래 세대에는 어떤 노래를 듣고 있을지 정말 궁금해지네요. 이분은 삶 자체가 선을 막 넘고 계세요.
이분들 저보고 외모 따지지 않잖아요.
동시에 노령화라고 하는 것들이 고령화라고 하는 것들이 기술 발전으로 수명이 더 늘어날 거라는 거죠.
This has been Peace Insight. Thank you for watching.
Korea, a globally recognized sports powerhouse. Behind the dazzling achievements, there's always an invisible force at work. With sophisticated materials, cutting-edge equipment, and innovative technological solutions, SMEs in the K-sports industry play a vital role in bolstering Korea's status as a sports powerhouse. By integrating AI technology, they unlock athletes' potential and enhance performance, elevating the sports environment to the next level and opening new markets in the sports industry. Their innovative technology and bold challenges drive the growth of Korea's sports industry, creating a better world through sports. The innovation of these SMEs never stops. A systematic partnership support program is implemented to discover promising sports SMEs, provide technical validation and R&D support to enhance competitiveness, and strengthen the foundation for overseas expansion. At Tokyo Sportech 2025, the technological prowess of Korean companies was recognized. The Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism, and the Korea Sports Promotion Foundation supported K-sports companies with product promotion and business consultations with global buyers, demonstrating product quality and market potential, and confirming the possibility of expanding into the global market.
저희는 ICT 강국으로서 그 바이어나 사용자들한테 신기술을 접목한 생활 스포츠 기회를 실질적으로 확대할 수 있는 그 기회를 제공하는데 많은 도움이 될 수 있으리라고 확신을 합니다.
이제 스포츠도 K죠. K 스포츠는 이겁니다.
The joy for all, created by the power of K-sports. Experience the future of the new sports industry through the innovation and technology of the Korean sports industry.
The moment we wear it, our spirits lift. It helps us grow strong in body and in mind. As we wear it, we learn patience and respect. The belt system motivates students to strive harder and continue growing. This uniform shapes movement into grace and turns performance into something thrilling. Now, embraced around the world, Taekwondo shares our culture philosophy, and values with pride and spirit. Though it may seem simple, this uniform holds your passion and your journey. It belongs to Taekwondo. Wear the extraordinary. Be with Taekwondo.
Briefings to the president continue, with President Lee Jae-myung vowing full support for science and technology and calling it the key to prosperity. He pledged a record 35 trillion won for R&D, stressing that researchers must not be afraid of trial and error. Seoul and Washington hold their first nuclear consultative group meeting under their respective new administrations. The allies reaffirmed the U.S. extended deterrence commitment, leveraging the full spectrum of American military capabilities. Search operations for 2 missing workers at the Gwangju Library construction collapse site were suspended for most of Friday due to safety risks. President Lee has ordered the mobilization of all available human and material resources for the rescue. Good evening. Welcome to Newscenter. We start with the second day of progress briefings by government entities, and today the Science Ministry took to the podium. President Lee Jae-myung also took this opportunity to highlight the importance of investments in the field of science and technology for future prosperity. Our correspondent Yoon Jung-min reports.
역사적으로 또 그러하지만 이 과학기술을 존중하는 사회 또는 국가, 과학기술에 투자하는 국가는 흔했습니다.
That was the assessment by President Lee Jae-myung as he was briefed by his science minister on key tasks as part of government ministry's back-to-back policy briefings for 2026. Noting the U.S. and China as an example, President Lee called for the need to invest more in science and technology, vowing to undo the budget cut for the R&D sector by the previous administration.
우리가 한때 대한민국의 성장 발전의 토대가 공부, 학습에 있다는 또는 직설적으로 얘기하면 연구개발 투자에 있다는 사실을 잠깐 망각한 때가 있었죠. 상당히 큰 타격이 있었습니다.
In 2026, a record high of 35 trillion won, worth over 24 billion US dollars, will be allocated for R&D. He also called for the need to create an environment where scientists and researchers are not afraid of trial and error, pointing out a government evaluation system that solely focuses on the success of research projects.
연구 실패하는 게 너무 당연한 거잖아요, 원래는. 장기 과제나 아니면 공공 영역의 R&D는 성공을 많이 하는 게 이상한 거예요. 그래 우리는 실패했다고 비난하고 성공하면 과제 더 주고 그러잖아요.
For that, he stressed the role of public officials.
여기 계신 공직자 여러분들의 마음의 자세와 태도가 정말로 중요합니다. 그 사회가 흥하냐 망하냐는 결국은 그 사회에 권한을 가진 사람들, 자원 배분의 권한을 가진 사람들에 달려 있는 것 같아요.
Friday's policy briefings in the administrative city of Sejong were also televised live in full. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Following the massive personal data breach at South Korean e-commerce giant Coupang, President Lee Jae-myung has called for tougher financial penalties against companies responsible for such leaks. Speaking at a policy briefing by the Personal Information Protection Commission on Friday, President Lee says sanctions should be strong enough to make companies fear they could go out of business. Under current regulations, companies can be fined up to 3% of their total revenue for data breaches, calculated based on the average revenue over the past 3 years. Yi suggested imposing penalties based on the highest revenue during that period rather than the 3-year average. In response, the Commission's chairperson said they're considering raising fines up to 10% of revenue in cases of repeated, serious violations. South Korea and the U.S. have held their first nuclear consultative group meeting since President Lee Jae-myung took office. During this, the U.S. reaffirmed its commitment to providing extended deterrence to South Korea. Our Cha Yoon-kyung reports.
The fifth meeting of the Nuclear Consultative Group, the South Korean-U.S. Standing Consultative Body on Nuclear Deterrence, was held on Thursday local time in Washington, D.C. Seoul's Ministry of National Defense said the meeting marked the first NCG session since South Korean President Lee Jae-myung and U.S. President Donald Trump took office. The meeting was attended by Kim Hong-chul, Deputy Minister for National Defense Policy, and Robert Sufer, Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Deterrence, Chemical and Biological Policies. After the meeting, the two sides released a joint statement. Deputy Minister Kim asserted that South Korea will continue to lead in maintaining and strengthening its conventional defense capabilities. Sufer reiterated Washington's pledge of extended deterrence to South Korea by leveraging the full spectrum of U.S. military capabilities, including its nuclear forces. The two sides agreed that enhanced nuclear deterrence exercises are helping improve the allies' decision-making coordination in potential nuclear contingencies. The Nuclear Consultative Group was launched in 2023 following the Washington Declaration, reaffirming the country's commitment to nuclear non-proliferation and the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Cha Yoon-kyung, Arirang News.
The Finance Ministry has reaffirmed its assessment that the Korean economy is on a recovery path, but adds that inflation remains a viable concern. Our correspondent Moon Ji-young reports.
The South Korean economy is continuing on a gradual recovery path. In its latest Green Book, the Ministry of Economy and Finance said domestic consumption is improving and semiconductor-led exports continue to show strength, helping the economy move out of the sluggishness seen in the first half of the year. But the ministry also pointed to volatility in monthly indicators due to long holiday periods and base effects, as well as ongoing employment challenges in vulnerable sectors. Industrial output in October fell 2.5% from a month earlier, the biggest drop in nearly 6 years, largely due to a sharp fall in semiconductor production, while service sector output also dipped slightly. Still, consumption showed resilience. Retail sales rose 3.5%, supported by stronger demand for semi-durable and non-durable goods as consumer sentiment climbed to its highest level in 8 years. Additionally, the number of Chinese visitors to Korea jumped nearly 27% from a year ago. Inflation, however, remains a concern. Consumer prices rose 2.4% in November, driven by higher agriculture and petroleum prices and the impact of a stronger U.S. dollar.
Rising prices for agricultural products and petroleum are adding pressure to household living costs. And with the weaker won also putting upward pressure on inflation, we plan to strengthen our policy response.
The ministry also warned that global uncertainties remain elevated, with major economies imposing new tariffs and trade tensions weighing on growth. To support momentum, the government plans to accelerate next year's budget execution from early 2026 and step up efforts to further boost domestic demand. Moon Ji-young, Arirang News.
Import prices in South Korea rose at their fastest pace in 19 months in November. The Bank of Korea says the weaker Korean won played a central role in driving costs higher. Lee Seung-jae has the details.
Import prices in South Korea rose at their fastest pace in 19 months in November, even as global oil prices declined. New data from the Bank of Korea on Friday shows that the weaker Korean won played the central role in driving costs higher. According to the preliminary figures, the import price index climbed 2.6% on month in November. That is an acceleration from the 1.9% increase recorded in October, and marks the fastest monthly gain since April 2024, when the index jumped 3.8%. It's also the 5th straight month of rising import prices. On a year-on-year basis, the index increased 2.2%. The report points to a significant depreciation of the Korean won. The currency averaged 1,457.77 won per dollar in November, compared with 1,423.36 won in October. That weaker exchange rate raised the cost of bringing goods into the country, even though oil prices moved in the opposite direction. Dubai crude, which is South Korea's key benchmark, edged down 0.8% to $64.47 a barrel. Economists note that import prices are a critical part of the broader inflation picture. Higher import costs flow directly into production expenses and can eventually push up consumer prices across the supply chain. That dynamic is likely to influence the central bank's outlook as it monitors inflation and currency stability heading into the new year. The data also highlights movement on the export side of the economy. The export price index rose for a 5th consecutive month in November, up 3.7% from October. Although the pace slowed from the 4.1% increase seen in the previous month, the continued upward trend suggests that Korean exporters are feeling the effects of both currency shifts and recovering global demand. Analysts say the combination of rising import and export prices underscores the challenges and opportunities facing the Korean economy at a time of volatile currency markets and global uncertainty. The BOK is expected to watch these indicators closely as it shapes policy in the months ahead. 이승재, Arirang News.
Mexico is imposing import tariffs of up to 50% on goods from South Korea, China, and other Asian nations that analysts believe are aimed at easing pressure from the Trump administration. Our Ian Jin explains.
The Senate of Mexico approved new tariff hikes on Wednesday, under which Mexico plans to impose up to 50% tariffs on 1,463 products from Asian countries that are not under a free trade agreement. This includes countries like Thailand, India, and Indonesia, but also China and South Korea. Set to take effect on January 1st, the new measures are being implemented on the back of President Claudia Sheinbaum's call for the country needing stronger tools to boost domestic production. South Korea's Ministry of Trade, Industry and Resources held an emergency meeting with Korean automobile, auto parts, and steel companies on Thursday, a day after the tariff hikes were approved. During the meeting, the ministry assessed that Mexico's tariff hike measures will likely only have a limited impact on South Korean exports due to Mexico's exemption on tariffs on imports of raw materials for export production. Most of Korea's exports to Mexico consist of components and raw materials processed by Korean companies to produce goods that are then exported to the United States. Despite such arrangements, official negotiations of a free trade agreement between South Korea and Mexico have remained stalled since talks began back in 2006. In 2000, the two countries signed an investment guarantee agreement, but this framework does not provide tariff exemptions. Addressing this, the South Korean Trade Ministry is set to convene a meeting soon to analyze the impact of the latest tariff hikes and to discuss possible countermeasures with business leaders. For Japan, as it has a free trade agreement with Mexico, this means it stands to gain a price advantage over Korea once the tariff hikes take effect. But China has warned that Mexico's new tariff measures would substantially undermine the interests of trade. China's Ministry of Commerce said that it hopes Mexico will correct such unilateralist and protectionist practices as soon as possible. Meanwhile, this comes as the United States continues to push countries in Latin America to limit their economic ties with China. 이은진, Arirang News.
Authorities in the southern city of Gwangju have temporarily stopped their search operations due to unsteady conditions at the scene of a public library construction site, which collapsed on Thursday. 2 missing workers have yet to be accounted for. President Lee Jae-myung has ordered all available resources to be mobilized for the rescue operation. Oh Soo-young has the latest.
Fire authorities in Gwangju stopped all search operations from 9:20 a.m. to 6 p.m. on Friday, citing dangerously unstable steel beams at the site of the new Gwangju Metropolitan Library. The framework, which was twisted, severed and weighed down by concrete, poses a high risk of secondary collapse, forcing rescue crews to step back until it has stabilized. The National Fire Agency held an emergency assessment with related agencies this morning and concluded that no search can proceed without full safety secured. Structural removal and rescue will move together only once conditions allow. Before the suspension, overnight operations continued, but with no trace of the 2 workers trapped, when a steel frame gave way as concrete was being poured. 4 workers were buried in Thursday's 2 p.m. collapse. 2 were recovered but later confirmed dead. Officials believe the initial failure on the rooftop triggered a chain reaction, causing the collapse. Experts point to faulty steel frame connections as a possible cause. Stabilization work is ongoing as debris is removed using heavy machinery, while thermal imaging cameras and other detection devices scan for signs of life. But as time passes and the concrete hardens, access is becoming increasingly difficult. President Lee Jae-myung has ordered relevant ministries to commit all available resources to the rescue.
행안부나 노동부나 또는 관련 부처에서 인적 물적 자산을 최대한 동원해가지고 일단 구조에 총력을 다하기를 바랍니다.
The Labour Minister has been directed to travel to the site immediately, while senior safety officials cancelled scheduled briefings to join response operations. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Visitors to the National Museum of Korea have surpassed 6 million so far this year, marking the highest annual attendance since its founding. The milestone pushes its cumulative visitor count past 100 million and positions the museum as the world's 4th most visited in the 2025 global rankings, following the Louvre, the Vatican Museums, and the British Museum. The museum credits innovative exhibitions and youth-focused programs, as well as a strong performance from its merchandise line, for its growing public appeal. South Korean entertainment giant HYBE has ranked 4th in Billboard's top promoters category. According to Billboard's 2025 year-end box score charts on Friday, HYBE earned roughly $469 million or around 691 billion Korean won from world tours over the past year. Thanks to tours from 17, BTS, J-Hope, and ENHYPEN, HYBE held 213 shows and drew 3.3 million fans. In Billboard's top tours chart, Stray Kids became the only K-pop act in the global top 10, landing at number 10 with $185 million and 1.3 million fans attending their Dominate World Tour. 17 followed at 17th, J-Hope 32nd, and ENHYPEN 37th. There are many reasons to wait for Fridays, and one of them is definitely the arts and culture coverage by our culture correspondent, Park Gun-woo. He's here in the studio with us. Welcome, Gun-woo.
Thanks for having me, Doyen.
What do you have for us today?
So this week, the prestigious Golden Globe Awards announced its nominees for the upcoming ceremony scheduled for January 11th. Star director Park Chan-wook's No Other Choice has been nominated for Best Motion Picture, Musical or Comedy, marking the first time a Korean movie has ever been selected in this main category. Director Bong Joon-ho's Parasite previously won Best Foreign Language Film in 2020, but No Other Choice will now compete in a top-tier category, going up against 5 other films, including One Battle After Another and Begonia. The film is also nominated in the Best Non-English Language Film category, where his film, Decision to Leave, was also a nominee 2 years ago. Its lead actor, Lee Byung-hun, has additionally surprised many by receiving a nomination for Best Male Actor in a Motion Picture, competing with 5 actors including Leonardo DiCaprio and Timothée Chalamet. One expert explains why all of this is so meaningful.
The awards has been criticized for lacking multicultural representation. But after its hosting body changed several years ago, it began considering racial and cultural diversity much more. International awards also don't nominate actors out of nowhere. They look at global activities and achievements. Lee Byung-hun's longtime work in Hollywood was likely taken into account, giving him a chance to actually win.
He added that even if no other choice does not end up winning, the nomination alone is already a major achievement, and that's because the film presents a well-suited thematic focus, addressing unemployment and the challenges posed by AI in the workplace, all through a Black comedy approach that balances both commercial appeal and artistic value.
Right, I thoroughly enjoy that movie actually, but I heard No Other Choice was not the only one that was in the spotlight this year.
Right, so I guess you also watched this film as well. It's K-pop Demon Hunters, directed by director Maggie Kang, which also drew significant attention as it received 3 nominations: Best Animated Motion Picture, Best Original Song, and Cinematic and Box Office Achievement. The same expert explains why this accomplishment is already remarkable in itself.
Others competing aren't original creations, but K-pop Demon Hunters is. It's becoming increasingly difficult to find original content in Hollywood, and the fact that an original animated film centered on K-pop was nominated is highly meaningful. Also, it's notable that a film released on a global streaming platform can still be appreciated on such a large scale. Shows how content distribution is changing.
And we also need to take a closer look at Begonia, as it too has a strong connection to Korea. Some people may wonder why, but the film is actually a remake of the 2003 South Korean movie Save the Green Planet. The expert elaborates on how this reflects a broader trend, showing that it's not only Korean original content that's shaping the global cinema landscape.
We're seeing multiple forms of Korean content expanding abroad. Not only original works, but also projects based on Korean culture, as well as collaborations with global platforms. Because all these different approaches to localization are successful. At the same time, even if a Korean project doesn't win an award, it still gives us confidence that greater achievements are on the way.
Right, like he says, there's greater achievements on the way, but this year has been particularly special with Korean content. How can we keep this going?
Right, so as you just mentioned, this year was another remarkable year for Korean content, as it got dominant globally, with many productions making a global splash. So now is the time to think about the next step, what Korea needs to do to sustain this momentum.
We need more thorough analysis of both content and audiences. More academic support and case-by-case studies are needed. If I were a content planner, I would create a global K-pop audition program, giving participants a mission to express what K-pop identity means through missions like cover dances. Then the essence of K-pop would naturally stand out.
He added that platforms like Arirang TV could also play a key role in this process, while also emphasizing that stronger government support will be necessary.
Right, Gwangju, and we all know you're in the forefront of all that. Thank you for that report, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. I guess I have no other choice but to go home. Have a nice weekend as well.
Get going.
Temperatures took a sharp dive overnight. In Seoul, daytime highs will stay around 3 degrees Celsius tomorrow and Sunday, and early winter cold is expected to stick around through the weekend. Moreover, rain and snow are expected across the country. Starting late tomorrow afternoon, heavy and wet snow will fall mainly in the center inland areas at a rate of around 1 to 3 centimeters per hour. Up to 10 centimeters of heavy snow is forecast in the western parts of Gangwon-do province and the mountainous areas of Jeju Island. We'll avoid sub-zero cold tomorrow morning with Seoul and Gwangju at 2 degrees, Daejeon and Gwangju at 1 degree. Daily highs will move up to only 3 degrees in Seoul, 8 degrees in Daejeon. We'll see another round of snow on Sunday after tomorrow's rain and snow take a break overnight. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That's all for this Friday evening. I'm Kim Do-yeon. Hope you have a great weekend.
The moment we wear it, our spirits lift. It helps us grow strong in body and in mind. As we wear it, we learn patience and respect. The belt system motivates students to strive harder and continue growing. This uniform shapes movement into grace and turns performance into something thrilling. Now, embraced around the world, Taekwondo shares our culture, philosophy, and values with pride and spirit. Though it may seem simple, this uniform holds your passion and your journey. It belongs to Taekwondo. Wear the extraordinary. Be with Taekwondo.
The magical door to the world of K-animation is swinging wide open. Meet your instant new BFF, the adorable Catch. Tina Ping will have you hooked from the very first glance. Need a hand? Our Robocar Poli Rescue team is always zooming in to save the day. How about tagging along on Pinkfong and Pal's super exciting quest to reclaim their lost magic? With the mysterious life forms Cabion by your side, you can become a Cabion master and save humanity like a total hero. Protecting children's innocence while igniting their boundless imagination. That's the magic of Korean animation. K-animation, the ultimate bestie for kids worldwide.
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mo-gyan. Tensions between China and Japan are rapidly escalating, from sharp diplomatic exchanges to direct military friction. Japan claims a Chinese jet locked its radar onto one of its fighters, a charge Beijing denies, but fears of accidental conflict are rising. The dispute, triggered by Japan's remarks on a Taiwan contingency, has already led to travel advisories, cultural boycotts, and mounting economic concerns. So with President Lee Jae-myung eyeing visits to both countries next year and the Dokdo issue once again surfacing, questions are growing over how South Korea can steer a steady course and perhaps play a stabilizing role. For more on this, we connect to Hanna Kim, an associate professor at Sagang University's GSIS. A big welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And also, we're joined by Daniel Connolly, an associate professor of international relations at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Good to see you.
Thank you for the invitation.
So let's begin our discussion with Professor Kim from how everything has started. So Japan's Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi's comments about a possible Taiwan contingency. And now the friction seems to be spilling over from the economic and cultural spheres into military tensions as well. How do you assess the current state of the China-Japan conflict, Professor?
I think the current tension between China and Japan has entered somewhat of a dangerous phase at this point. This is because diplomatic friction risks spilling over into heightened military confrontation, as you mentioned. Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi stated in the Diet that a contingency involving Taiwan could pose an existential threat to Japan. So this goes beyond Tokyo's usual strategic ambiguity on Taiwan. And she further suggests that Japan might consider military involvement if necessary. So of course, Beijing is going to react with strong opposition. China has consistently maintained its adherence to the One China principle. It has always stressed that the Taiwan issue is an internal matter and that it will not tolerate interference by any third party. And in particular, Taiwan has been defined by China as the core of its core interests. So from Beijing's perspective, Prime Minister Takaichi's remarks are highly provocative. And because of this, in response, China has stepped up pressure on Japan through economic and cultural retaliatory measures. You mentioned like the tourists, visiting and things like that. But now this has also then rapidly escalated tensions as well. So as a result of this, bilateral relations are increasingly moving beyond economic and diplomatic disputes and towards the risk of genuine and increasingly confrontational military tension.
Definitely. So when we speak about military tensions, we hear that Japan has accused China's fighter jet of locking its radar into a Japanese aircraft. And China, for its part, says this hasn't happened. Professor Conley, so given the lack of solid military communication channels between the two, how likely is an accidental military crash, which everyone's concerned about?
Well, absolutely. There's always a very real risk of accidental escalation when you have military forces from two rival countries operating in very close environment. And let's remember the context of this most recent encounter. The Chinese aircraft carrier group was doing takeoff and landing exercises, which for an aircraft carrier is the most vulnerable you can be. And there were Japanese aircraft shadowing it. And this is when allegedly the Chinese fighters turned on their radar. This is a very dangerous act, of course, if it happened, because the next step would be firing missiles, the radar-guided missiles. And this meant that there's a very high risk of miscalculation, maybe someone fearing that someone's going to shoot first, so they want to fire first. Now, while I doubt that the pilots on either side are likely to deliberately take a shot, both militaries, are relatively well trained. They do have discipline, but it is very possible for a miscalculation, an error, or a mechanical breakdown. For example, imagine if one of those Japanese F-15s accidentally crashed shortly after the Chinese radar was turned on. What would have happened then? And it's not an impossible scenario. In October of this year, an American F-18 and a helicopter operating from the US Nimitz crashed within 30 minutes of each other in the South China Sea. Probably it was contaminated fuel, which caused both of these aircraft to crash. But imagine if this had occurred in a standoff with Chinese ships and aircraft, it could have really escalated out of control.
Definitely. So just a little, very small misstep without a hotline could even escalate the situation very quickly. Now, we've been saying that Beijing has responded with a series of retaliatory measures, including a travel advisory for Japan, canceling Japanese concerts, and more. Professor Kim, what is the end game we're expecting here for China? Is it hoping to force a shift in Japan's stance on Taiwan?
I think there might be several strategic objectives behind China's kind of across-the-board retaliatory measures against Japan. First, by increasing political and economic costs within Japan, Beijing appears to be trying to encourage the Japanese government to adopt a more cautious approach to the Taiwan issue in the future. So it almost seems like a soft warning in a way. But also, and at the same time, China seems intent on generating domestic pressures within Japan by imposing economic, cultural, and travel-related penalties. The decline in Chinese tourism, the cancellation of cultural events, and various forms of trade or export restrictions directly affect Japan's business community and cultural sector. And this potentially creates constituencies that favor a softer policy stance as well. And also, China's pairing these measures with signals of military tension and warning. So this goes beyond the mere expression of diplomatic dissatisfaction. And by doing this, Beijing may be aiming to demonstrate its resolve and leverage not only towards Japan, but it may also be sending a broader message or a broader strategic message to other countries as well. Those with the intention of and it's kind of discouraging other countries from intervening in the Taiwan issues. So in many ways, China's kind of sending a warning not just to Japan, but everyone else about the Taiwan issue. And so ultimately, these actions are serving a strategic signaling purpose. China's showing both regional audiences as well as domestic audience and foreign governments as well that Beijing treats perceived challenges on core interests like Taiwan very seriously and is ready to apply pressure in a multidimensional way, whether it's economic, political, and many other ways.
So clearly we're really seeing a stern response from China over there. And over in Japan, some people have already expressed concern about this escalating situation and also about the economic toll of this diplomatic fallout. But yet, Prime Minister Takaichi shows really no sign of walking back on her statements. Professor Connolly, what do you think is the strategic calculation behind the Japanese Prime Minister's decision?
Yeah, and as they say, right, international relations is always a two-level game. You have the international relations and then you have the domestic politics. And I think in essence, what she's doing here is she's sacrificing the relationship with China for, I think, a strong element of domestic agendas. And I would say in maybe ranked order, the first is simply strengthening her coalition. There was a poll this week suggesting that the anti-China stance is relatively popular in Japan. Definitely her kind of far-right coalition partners, the Innovation Party, they support her stance. I think more fundamentally, though, it also serves some policy agendas. She has this kind of desire to remilitarize Japan. She has before said she wants to repeal Article 9. And I think by provoking China into this very militarized, very aggressive response, she may be able to justify more military spending, more of an aggressive Japanese stance in the future. And in this regard, maybe a more hostile China is definitely a heavy domestic price for Japan to pay, but it may help her domestic policy agendas in the future. And maybe the third factor could be the U.S. alliance. Traditionally, the U.S. has always encouraged its East Asian allies to take a more stronger stance against China, and Japan is very much doing so right now. But in this case, perhaps she miscalculated a little because the U.S. reaction was initially a little colder maybe than Japanese policymakers thought.
Right. In fact, lately we just saw yesterday that the White House has actually avoided direct mention, and it said that it maintains good relations with both countries. In fact, Professor Kim, how should we interpret the stance by Washington? And do you think Washington's cautious approach could be a variable in how this conflict would unfold?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, right now, the White House has refrained from taking an explicit position on the tensions between China and Japan. Professor Connolly mentioned that, in the past, this was slightly different, but in this case, now we're seeing the U.S. stance shift a little bit. Right now, the U.S. has reiterated a general stance that it maintains good relations with both countries. And it's likely that this reflects a strategic calculation by the U.S. government, because on the one hand, the U.S. is emphasizing its alliance with Japan. But at the same time, the U.S. is seeking to preserve a pragmatic and stable relationship with China. So for Washington, the alliance with Japan remains critically important, but maintaining stability in U.S.-China relations has become increasingly salient in light of the recent contacts between President Trump and President Xi Jinping. And this is also affecting ongoing trade negotiations as well. And so we have seen the U.S.-China relationship quite strained within the past few years, even starting from the first Trump admin term. And so in this sense, the U.S. posture can be interpreted as a form of what we would describe as balancing diplomacy. It's designated to reassure allies while avoiding an unnecessary escalation of tensions with Beijing. But that being said, from Japan's perspective, the absence of this strong and explicit public support from Washington, especially when it's combined with what many perceive as U.S. diplomatic entrenchment in Europe and the Middle East, this is very likely to deepen doubts about the credibility of America's security commitments. And on a side note, this may also affect South Korea as well, because Korea occupies a geopolitically similar position to Japan. And so Korea may also begin to harbor greater skepticism regarding the reliability of U.S. security assurances. So in many ways, this is affecting a lot of different countries.
Right, definitely. So it's very intertwined and it's connected, and we have to focus on each country's national interests. But as Professor Kim has mentioned, Professor Connolly, how do you foresee this impact of this standoff in the broader security landscape in Northeast Asia?
Well, definitely in the short term, there's going to be an elevated risk of military clashes. And even though the missile lock-on incident happened on the weekend, throughout this week, actually, as the Chinese aircraft carrier group was sailing past, we saw a lot of Japanese military activity, including flights of aircraft armed with anti-ship missiles. This is quite unprecedented sorts of activities going on. We've had Russian and Chinese bombers flying patrols, including into South Korea's ADIZ. And just yesterday, U.S. nuclear-capable B-52 bombers made a flight with Japanese fighter planes, maybe a belated show of support. So in the short term, with all of these different military aircraft and ships, there's certainly an elevated risk. Long term, I think we need to maybe go back to what Professor Kim said about the importance of Taiwan to China. I think what China's doing right here is demonstrating its commitment, its red lines, and it really, I think, forces policymakers in Seoul and Tokyo and other countries in the region that when we talk about Taiwan, we may be talking about war with China. And I think it's something that we need to take more seriously. In the past, there was a lot of attempts to talk about the cross-straits issue without imagining a conflict with China. But I think this incident really shows China showing that, no, it is a high risk like that. At the same time, there's greater questions about U.S. support in the region. And the recent release of the U.S. National Security Strategy, it does emphasize Asia more, but it also raises this fear that the United States may do exactly what it did in Europe, right? It promoted Ukraine throughout much of the 2000s, and now suddenly it appears to be abandoning them. So I think a bleaker, more realist world is the lesson of this crisis.
Right, definitely, since we're seeing a lot of tensions both on the air and in the waters as well. It's quite a tough situation for South Korea as well. President Lee Jae-myung, he's considering state visits to both China and Japan in the year 2026. And amid this volatile situation, Professor Kim, what kind of practical diplomatic path do you think should South Korea take?
Yeah, in many ways, South Korea is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place with this. As tensions between China and Japan continue to escalate into the military and security realm, South Korea is very likely, or more likely, to pursue a pragmatic diplomatic approach rather than actively positioning itself as a mediator. But there are clear structural limitations to Seoul playing a full-fledged mediating role here. The Taiwan issue and the China-Japan dispute are deeply embedded in U.S.-China strategic competition. It's also deeply embedded in the U.S.-Japan alliance, as well as China's core interests. So this leaves South Korea with only limited leverage to shape outcomes. And an overly ambitious attempt at mediation could, in fact, increase South Korea's diplomatic burdens rather than reduce them. So it could make things a lot worse. And it's very likely that President Lee Jae-myung is well aware of these constraints. So as a result of this, I believe it's more probable that Seoul will refrain from pushing itself into a mediator role and instead maintain a principled stance that calls for restraint and de-escalation, but doing this without directly intervening in China-Japan relations.
A cautious stance is very crucial, it seems as though, for South Korea, especially since we're expecting a South Korea-Japan summit around January next year. But lately, Prime Minister Takaichi reignited controversy by asserting Japan's sovereignty over the Dokdo Islands. Professor Conley, do you see that claim as a move that's aimed at domestic politics, or it's more of a deliberate diplomatic signal to Korea?
I think it's a little bit of both. Definitely, she scores points with a lot of her domestic right-wing supporters when she says this. But I would suggest that Japan does make a practice of this. And in the world of social media, right, we're used to this term rage bait, where you post something on social media that you know is going to get a lot of angry comments. Well, in the diplomatic world, there's a very similar strategy. You provoke a country, hope they overreact. And if they overreact too much, they look irrational and you look like a victim. And traditionally, Japan has always been able to provoke Korea by raising the Dokdo issue. And I would say maybe this whole crisis over Taiwan would be a very similar example of Japan doing this, but the reaction was much greater than they expected. And Dokdo, with South Korea as a bit of a safer button to push for the Japanese Prime Minister. But I would also suggest that it could be a negotiating move. So, for example, if she provokes the Dokdo issue now, then at the summit, if she doesn't, it's seen as a concession. But if she never raised the Dokdo issue at all, then to make a signal, a concession, she would have to do something much more substantial. So by talking about Dokdo now, she might be able to be more gracious at the actual summit.
A very interesting point. So it could be a strategic move from the Japanese Prime Minister. What about Professor Kim? Do you agree on this? And you know, of course, South Korea's presidential office quickly issued a strong rebuttal of this. Do you think there's still room for both sides to push forward while managing their differences?
I completely agree with Professor Connolly. You know, this is a really strategic move. It's also, you know, not just appealing to the domestic audience, but Prime Minister Takaishi is going to be able to utilize this in many ways. And, you know, in many ways, it does seem like the rage bait kind of situation. You know, she knows that these kinds of remarks are going to be, it's going to create a huge reaction from South Korea. And, you know, any remark regarding Dokdo is, you know, it brings up one of the most sensitive historical and sovereignty issues in South Korea-Japan relations. You know, it brings it back to the forefront. So as a result of this, as you mentioned, the presidential's office swift and forceful response was in many ways and domestically almost unavoidable. Issues of this nature leave little room for compromise on either side. So in the short term, they are likely to cast a shadow over the atmosphere surrounding the upcoming summit. As Professor Connolly mentioned, if the Prime Minister doesn't bring this up, you know, then it can look good for her as well. But that being said, it would be an overstatement to argue that this issue alone could derail the summit altogether. You know, both Seoul and Tokyo are acutely aware of the need to manage their bilateral relationship in the current international environment. You know, this is the current international environment, which is marked by intensifying U.S.-China strategic competition, the North Korean problem, and broader regional security uncertainties. So the key question is whether both sides can avoid amplifying the issue and succeed in controlling the actual agenda. And to put this in other words, while Prime Minister Takaishi's comments clearly constitute a negative variable for Korea, there still remains room on both sides to move the relationship forward if strategic considerations take precedence. So ultimately, the success of the summit will depend less on reaffirmed principled positions than on how effectively both governments can contain and manage their differences.
So we'll have to see on the atmosphere of how the summit would unfold. Now, when we look long term, then Professor Connolly, if we want to see a stable recovery and trilateral ties between South Korea, China, and Japan, what do you think are possible concrete trust building steps?
Well, I think the first thing could be, and this is maybe building on what Professor Kim said earlier, is not doing anything, right? In terms of if South Korea tries to too aggressively put itself forward as a problem solver, it might alienate both sides. Maybe sometimes breaking the cycle of provocations means not overreacting, maybe focusing on other issues that are not so sensitive. And I think certainly President Lee's whole agenda of pragmatic diplomacy, focusing on AI, aging populations, facilitating trade, these are all areas where all three countries have vested interests. And this could be, I think, in the short term, a more fruitful avenue to pursue. More long term, in terms of the security situation in the region, I do think Northeast Asia needs something similar to the Cold War era Incidents at Sea agreement. And this was an agreement signed between the USSR and the United States in 1972. And it basically created basic guidelines for Soviet and US aircraft and ships, how they should behave when they're close to each other to avoid accidents or miscalculations. And I think what we saw this week, lots of military forces operating in close proximity. And South Korea is guilty of this behavior as well. Let's not forget back in 2018, a South Korean warship turned on its radar on a Japanese surveillance plane. And in 2019, South Korean fighter jets fired hundreds of warning shots at a Russian plane over Dokdo. So I think all countries in the region are guilty of sometimes excessive behavior. And if South Korea took the lead in committing itself to the guidelines of an incidents at sea kind of agreement, maybe it could help establish a pattern of responsible behavior in the region and prevent similar situations from occurring. Even though we can't agree on the big strategic issues, we can at least set some basic guidelines for ships and aircraft how to behave in a civilized fashion.
A very good reminder for us, Professor Connell. We'll really have to see how South Korea could navigate this tense moment under President Lee's pragmatic diplomatic policy. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Connolly.
My pleasure.
And of course, Professor Kim, for your time and for your insights tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.